Hi, Dr. Bertolotti here. I wanted to talk a little bit about language skills and our assessment of them and its relationship with assessing vocabulary and grammar. And I thought that this graphic might help. So we might consider that there are four main language skills: reading, writing, listening, speaking. We have written language skills, we have oral language skills, and here on the left are the receptive skills, as Green talks about them, and the productive skills. We could consider these the using language. This is when we focus on these, we're building our learners' communicative competence. They're learning how to use the language, which is the terminal goal of language teaching, language instruction. But down here, we have some, maybe we can think of as building blocks. Before we can read and write and listen and speak, we need to have some knowledge of vocabulary of the language and some knowledge of the grammar of the language. So these building blocks help us. We demonstrate our knowledge of the language using our vocabulary and grammar knowledge, and we demonstrate them when we use the language. When we talk about knowledge about the language, things that you can say that you know about a language, like I know this word means this, that's called declarative knowledge. And, you know, as opposed to these where you can't really say how you're learning, what you know about reading. It's too complex. It's many processes. And as Brown says, we can't really see the process or the product of these receptive skills. So when we're assessing language, we have choices. And if we're in the ideas about whether or not we should assess the vocabulary and grammar, these building blocks, we could take the position that I'm not going to assess them. I'm not going to assess my learners' declarative knowledge about the language. You know, a learner might have 150 vocabulary words, but if they can't use it in their writing or speaking, or if they can't understand them in their reading and listening, that doesn't matter to me. I care about their terminal, using their communicative competence. I want them to express their knowledge of vocabulary and their knowledge of grammar in these main language skills. So that's one stand that we could take. And you see this in instructors that hold a communicative competence framework. If that's the framework that they believe in, that they might choose not to assess vocabulary and grammar separately. Now, I think that's when I say vocabulary and grammar, I mean they might not choose to ever test vocabulary isolated from these other skills. They might not choose to teach grammar. It's not so much this relationship, but this relationship, whether these are taught, these are assessed within the other skills. Now, the other side of that might be that we might choose to test a learner's vocabulary. We might choose to test the learner's grammar, not integrated with these other skills, but as sub-skills to help them get to these broader skills. So in this text-based assessment, what I'm asking you to do is create a text-based assessment, either a vocabulary test, a grammar test, a reading test, or a listening test. And as I say here, that should be formatted exactly how the learners would use it. But then I want to know how you would score it. But then I want you to talk about what you have done. So here in part 4 is your reflection of why you chose to do the assessment that you designed. I want you to identify whether or not you are testing grammar and vocabulary isolated as individual sub-skills, or as an integrated task. Again, going back to this picture, are you testing just vocabulary or just grammar? Or probably not, but maybe you're testing both of these. Are you isolating it, focusing only on grammar skills? Or are you really focusing on reading skills, which just will naturally include vocabulary and grammar, because in order to read, you need to have vocabulary knowledge and grammar knowledge. Same with listening. I hope that makes more sense. So let's go back. So you want to identify and justify why you are testing it the way that you were testing it. Green talks about why you might want to do that. Brown talks about in chapter 11 why you might want to do each of those. Then in B, you are to evaluate the assessment's validity, reliability, practicality, and beneficial consequences, which we have practiced doing, but you also have to include identifying which principle is most strengthened by how you are assessing grammar and vocabulary. In that, are you assessing it as a part of the other skills or as an isolated skill? And then by doing that, which is most threatened? I hope that clarifies what I mean when I talk about assessing vocabulary as an isolated skill, focusing on vocabulary, assessing grammar as an isolated skill, focusing just on grammar. And the examples would be for vocabulary, like a matching test, or I'm going to give you the definition, you write the vocabulary word, or I give you the vocabulary word, or you write the definition, right? You're just focusing on the learner's knowledge about the language. And an example of grammar would be, for instance, a verb conjugation, something like that, where you're not asking the learners to speak using verb forms, but just give the verb forms. And that's assessing vocabulary and grammar in an isolated. Or you might choose to assess these building blocks skills, this kind of knowledge, the knowledge of vocabulary and the knowledge of the grammar of the language within these other skills, within the communicative skills. For instance, you might give a learner a reading passage or a listening passage, and of course they would need to use their knowledge of vocabulary and grammar in order to do that. And that might include that you ask about understanding vocabulary in context, but that would be integrated because it's using the communicative competence. The focus is on the communicative competence, using the language. And this is what like WIDA standards encourage, right? Always focusing on integrated skills. I hope that clarifies. Please post questions.